The price of a shadow was a soul. Please, just for the boy. He can't walk another mile. The wind was a thief, stealing the warmth from a sun that gave none. It scoured the plains, whipping dust and dead grass against the legs of the woman who stood braced against it, a small, still shape in the vast, uncaring emptiness. Her voice was nearly lost in the gale, a thread of sound worn thin by desperation. Silas heard it, though. He heard it from the edge of his porch, where he'd been watching their slow, faltering approach for the better part of an hour. A woman and a child, two specks of suffering crawling across his horizon. He had hoped they would turn, that they would see the inhospitable nature of his land and choose another path. They had not. Now they stood at the foot of his property, just beyond the crude fence line that marked the boundary between his solitude and the rest of the world. The woman's shoulders were slumped, not in defeat, but in a weariness so profound it seemed to have settled into her bones. The boy beside her, no more than 5 or 6, leaned heavily against her leg, his face buried in the folds of her worn skirt. His small frame trembled, whether from cold or exhaustion, Silas couldn't tell. Silas remained motionless, a part of the weathered wood of his cabin. His hands, calloused and hard from years of solitary work, rested on the porch rail. He was a man who had made a pact with silence, who had traded the noise of the world for the quiet ache of memory. Intruders were not welcome. Compassion was a currency he no longer possessed. He had spent it all years ago and been left bankrupt. He watched them. The woman did not look at him directly, but at the ground near his feet, a gesture of submission that grated on him. Her plea hung in the air between them, a fragile thing in the face of the wind's howl. He should have told them to move on. He should have pointed them toward the town, a full day's walk south, and shut his door. It was what he always did. It was how he survived. But the boy coughed, a dry, rattling sound that seemed to tear right through the fabric of the wind. The woman's hand went instantly to the child's back, rubbing small, futile circles. It was a gesture of pure instinct, a mother's shield against a world of hurt. Silas felt something shift inside him, a rusty gear grinding into motion after years of disuse. It was the memory of another small hand, another rattling cough. He pushed the thought away hard, but the echo remained. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. His own voice, when it came, was rough, like stones grinding together. "Barn's warm enough. There's hay." The woman looked up then, her eyes meeting his for the first time. They were the color of a winter sky, shadowed with caution and a deep, settled pain. He saw no gratitude in them, only a flicker of assessment. She was weighing one danger against another, the certainty of the cold against the uncertainty of him. He was a stranger, a man living alone at the edge of nowhere. He understood her hesitation. He might have been the very kind of man she was fleeing. "He needs water," she said, her voice still quiet but firm. It was not a request. It was a condition. Silas gave a curt nod, his jaw tight. He turned without another word and walked back into the cabin, the heavy door groaning shut behind him. The silence inside was thick, a familiar blanket. But today it felt different, felt violated. He picked up a bucket and headed for the well, the routine motion a comfort against the intrusion. He was only offering the barn, a bucket of water, nothing more. This was not an invitation. It was a temporary truce with a world he had long since abandoned. He was a man of ghosts and fences. He knew better than to let anyone inside. The barn smelled of dry hay, old leather, and the faint, earthy scent of the single milk cow that shifted in her stall as they entered. A lantern hung from a central beam, casting a pool of weak, golden light that pushed back the encroaching gloom of dusk. It was cavernous and drafty, but the thick walls blunted the relentless assault of the wind, and the body heat from the animals offered a meager warmth. To Alara, after weeks on the open plains, it felt like a cathedral. She guided Leo to a pile of clean hay in an empty stall, her movements slow and deliberate, conserving what little energy she had left. The boy sank into the hay without a word, curling into a tight ball. his small body finally succumbing to the exhaustion that had dogged their every step. She pulled her thin shawl from her shoulders and tucked it around him, though it offered little real protection against the chill. The heavy barn door creaked open, and Silas entered. He carried a bucket of water in one hand and 2 tin cups in the other. In his other arm he held a thick, gray wool blanket. He set the items down just inside the stall, careful not to step too close. He moved with a kind of contained stillness, every action measured, as if he were afraid of making too much noise, of taking up too much space. Alara watched him, her body tense. She remained on her knees beside her son, a silent sentinel. She had learned long ago that kindness from strange men often came with a price she was unwilling to pay. This man's charity felt different. It was grudging, impersonal. That, paradoxically, made her trust it slightly more. Felt honest. He filled one of the cups and pushed it toward her. "Drink." She took it, her fingers brushing his for a fleeting second. His hand was rough as bark and surprisingly warm. She drank slowly, the cool water a balm to her parched throat. She then filled the cup again and gently roused Leo, helping him sip the water. He drank greedily, his eyes barely open, before slumping back into the hay. Silas had not moved. He stood there, a tall shadow just beyond the lantern light, watching the small domestic scene. He felt a pang of something he couldn't name, a hollow echo in his chest. He cleared his throat. "There's stew on the stove in the house. You can fetch a bowl," he paused, his next words feeling awkward and clumsy. "The boy, too." Alara looked from the man back to her sleeping son. The offer of real food, of hot food, was a temptation that made her stomach clench with hunger. But the thought of entering that cabin, of placing herself and her son more firmly under this man's roof, sent a tremor of fear through her. The barn felt defensible. A house felt like a trap. "We're fine here," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. A muscle twitched in Silas's jaw. He was not a man accustomed to having his offers, however reluctant, refused. He looked at the boy, at the pale translucence of his skin, the dark circles under his eyes. He looked at the woman, at the fierce, protective set of her shoulders and the exhaustion etched so deeply around her eyes it seemed a permanent part of her features. He saw her pride, a brittle thing she held up like a shield. "Suit yourself," he muttered, turning to leave. He stopped at the doorway. "I'll be up before dawn. I expect work for shelter. You can cook, clean. The boy, he can gather eggs. If he's able." It was a business transaction. Shelter for labor. That Alara understood. It was a language the world had taught her well. It was safe, definable. She wouldn't be taking charity. She would be earning her keep. She could hold onto her dignity, what was left of it. She looked at Leo, his breathing shallow but even in his sleep. For him, she would do anything. She would cook for the devil himself if it meant a warm place for her son to lay his head. "We'll be ready," she said to the man's retreating back. He gave no sign that he'd heard, simply pulling the heavy door shut behind him, plunging the barn back into a dim, quiet stillness. Alara pulled the coarse wool blanket over herself and Leo, the scent of wood smoke and cold air clinging to its fibers. It was his scent. She lay there for a long time, listening to the wind and the soft chewing of the cow, her hand resting on her son's chest, feeling the small, steady rhythm of his heart. She did not sleep. She waited for a dawn she wasn't sure she wanted to see. She stayed. A rhythm was established, built not on words but on the silent, shared labor of survival. Silas would rise in the pre-dawn dark, the scrape of his boots on the cabin floor the first sound of the day. He would light the stove, his movements economical and precise, and be gone to the far pastures by the time Alara and Leo emerged from the barn. She would find a pail of fresh milk and a stack of firewood waiting by the cabin door, a silent provision that was neither kind nor unkind. It was simply there. Her days were spent inside his home, a space that felt as empty as the man himself. The cabin consisted of a single room, sparsely furnished with a sturdy table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, and a stone hearth that dominated the far wall. Everything was meticulously clean, worn but well-maintained. There were no pictures, no decorations, no sign of a life lived within these walls beyond the bare necessities. It was a shell, not a home. She cooked and cleaned with a quiet efficiency, scrubbing the floors until the wood gleamed, washing the few dishes, and preparing a simple, hearty meal for the evening. Leo, gaining strength with each passing day, took to his chore of collecting eggs with a solemn importance. He was a quiet child, his laughter stolen by the road, but he would sometimes hold up a particularly fine egg for his mother's inspection, a small smile gracing his lips. These were the moments that sustained her. They ate their evening meal in silence. Silas would sit at one end of the table, Elara and Leo at the other. The only sounds were the clink of forks against tin plates and the crackle of the fire. The space between them felt immense, a chasm of unspoken histories. Elara never asked questions. She did not want to know his story, and she certainly did not want to share hers. Their arrangement was one of utility, and emotion was a dangerous complication. Silas, for his part, found the presence of the woman and child both a comfort and an irritation. The smell of baking bread that now filled his cabin was a ghost of a scent from a lifetime ago, stirring memories he fought to keep buried. The boy's small, hesitant movements reminded him of other, smaller footsteps that had once echoed in this room. He found himself watching them when he thought they weren't looking. He saw the way Elara would discreetly push the largest piece of meat onto Leo's plate, the way her hand would hover protectively near his shoulder when Silas moved too quickly. He saw the fierce, unyielding love of a mother who had nothing else in the world to give. One afternoon, while mending a fence at the far end of his property, he found a small object in the dirt. It was a bird, crudely carved from a piece of soft wood, its wings outstretched as if in flight. It was small enough to fit in the palm of his hand, smoothed by countless touches. He recognized it instantly. He had seen the boy, Leo, clutching it tightly on that first day. He must have dropped it. Silas picked it up, the wood warm from the sun, and slipped it into his pocket. That night, after Elara and Leo had retired to the barn, Silas took the small wooden bird from his pocket. He held it for a long time, turning it over and over in his rough hands. It was a simple, childish thing, yet it felt heavy with significance. It was a link to the boy, a symbol of the fragile innocence that had taken root on his land. He thought of his own daughter, of the small corn-husk doll he had made for her, now buried with her in the cold earth. With a sigh that seemed to rise from the depths of his soul, he walked to the barn. He moved silently, his footsteps muffled by the soft earth. The door creaked open just enough for him to slip inside. In the dim light, he could see the two of them, huddled together under the gray blanket. Leo's small hand was curled on the hay beside his head, empty. Carefully, quietly, Silas knelt and placed the small wooden bird into the boy's open palm. The boy's fingers curled around it instinctively in his sleep, a small, contented sigh escaping his lips. Silas retreated as silently as he had come, closing the door on the scene. It was an act of kindness he would never acknowledge, a secret shared only with the shadows. The unspoken kindnesses began to accumulate, small gestures that fell like quiet rain on the dry ground of their existence. Elara would find the water bucket by the door was not as heavy as it used to be, realizing Silas was filling it only halfway so she could carry it more easily. A loose floorboard in the cabin that she tripped over one morning was mysteriously fixed by evening. A small, three-legged stool appeared by the hearth, the perfect height for Leo to sit and warm his feet. She never mentioned them, and he never offered an explanation. They were simply facts, changes in her small world that spoke a language louder than words. She, in turn, began to leave a tin cup of hot coffee on the edge of the porch for him before she and Leo returned to the barn for the night. The first time he found it, he stopped, staring at the steam rising into the cold night air. He hadn't had coffee made for him in a decade. He drank it slowly, the warmth spreading through his chest, a feeling that had little to do with the heat of the liquid. The weather began to turn. The crisp autumn air sharpened, carrying the first real bite of winter. The sky, for for days on end, was a low, bruised ceiling of gray clouds. The wind picked up, moaning around the corners of the cabin like a restless spirit. It was a familiar melancholy, a season that had always mirrored the landscape of Silas's own soul. But now the approaching cold held a new kind of dread. The barn was sturdy, but it was not a place for a woman and child to weather a blizzard. One afternoon, Alara was reaching for a sack of flour on a high shelf in the pantry. Her sleeve, worn and frayed at the cuff, rode up her arm, exposing the pale skin of her forearm. For a moment, she was unaware, her focus entirely on her task. Silas, entering the cabin to fetch a whetstone, froze in the doorway. There, stark against her skin, were the faint, discolored marks of old bruises. They were faded, yellow-green ghosts of past violence, arranged in a pattern that could only have been left by a gripping hand. He saw the darker, more distinct marks of fingerprints just above her wrist. His eyes traced the story of cruelty written on her skin, and a cold, hard anger settled in his gut. It was a familiar rage, an old friend he had tried to bury long ago, the rage of a man who had failed to protect the ones he loved. Alara, sensing his presence, turned. She saw the direction of his gaze and her arm dropped instantly, her sleeve falling back into place. A flush of shame and fear colored her cheeks. She turned away from him, her back rigid, her silence a wall slammed down between them. She expected a question, a judgment, perhaps even a look of revulsion. Silas said nothing. He walked past her to the shelf, retrieved his whetstone, and walked back out without a word. But the air in the room had changed. The quiet between them was no longer just empty. It was now filled with a shared, unspoken knowledge. He understood now, not just her weariness, but the source of her deep, abiding caution. He understood the shadows in her eyes. She was not just a woman down on her luck. She was a survivor, and the man who had left those marks on her skin was more than a memory. He was a threat that still breathed, somewhere out there in the world. The howling of the wind outside seemed to grow louder, a harbinger of the storm that was to come, both outside and within. The storm broke with a fury that seemed bent on tearing the world from its foundations. It began as sleet, a sharp, stinging volley against the cabin's lone window, before thickening into a blinding wall of snow. The wind shrieked, a physical force that rattled the door in its frame and sent icy drafts searching for cracks in the chinking. Within hours, the world outside was gone, erased by a swirling vortex of white. Silas had brought them in from the barn just as the first flakes began to fall, an unspoken command that Alara had not questioned. Now, the three of them were confined to the small, one-room cabin, the space shrinking with every passing hour. The fire roared in the hearth, a lone bastion of warmth and light against the raging blizzard. That evening, Leo began to cough. At first, it was small and dry, but as the night wore on, it deepened, becoming a harsh, rasping sound that tore at Alara's heart. A fever set in, swift and vicious. His skin grew hot to the touch, his cheeks flushed a frightening red, and his breathing became shallow and rapid. He began to murmur in his sleep, small, nonsensical phrases, lost in the delirium of the fever. Alara was frantic. She bathed his forehead with a cloth dipped in cool water, but it seemed to have no effect. The heat radiating from his small body was terrifying. She felt a familiar, helpless terror creeping up her spine, the fear of a mother who knows she is powerless against the forces of nature and sickness. She was alone, trapped, and her child was slipping away from her. She was so consumed by her fear that she didn't notice Silas until he was kneeling beside her. He placed a hand on Leo's forehead, his touch surprisingly gentle. His face was a grim mask, his eyes dark with a concern that went beyond mere obligation. "He needs to sweat it out," he said, his voice low and steady. "We need to break the fever." He moved with a sudden, focused energy. He stoked the fire until it blazed, filling the cabin with a sweltering heat. From a small wooden chest in the corner, a chest Alara had never seen him open, he pulled out dried herbs, yarrow and willow bark. He knew what he was doing. He crushed them and steeped them in hot water, the bitter, medicinal scent filling the air. "Hold him up," he commanded. Alara obeyed without thinking, lifting Leo's limp body. Silas gently spooned the bitter tea into the boy's mouth, murmuring quiet, soothing words as Leo choked and sputtered. "Easy now, son. Just a little. It'll help." For the rest of the night, Silas did not leave the boy's side. He sat on the floor by the small pallet Alara had made, bathing Leo's face, forcing sips of the herbal tea and water between his lips. Alara watched him, her own exhaustion a heavy weight. She saw not a gruff, solitary rancher, but a man who had done this before. His hands, though calloused and scarred, were deft and sure. There was a terrible sadness in his competence, a knowledge born of a loss she could only begin to imagine. Sometime in the deepest, darkest hour of the night, with the wind howling its mournful song, Alara finally gave in to her exhaustion. She slumped against the wall, her eyes closing. When she awoke, it was to a profound silence. The wind had died down. The first, pale light of dawn was filtering through the snow-caked window. She looked over at her son. Leo was sleeping peacefully. The fiery flush was gone from his cheeks. His skin was cool to the touch, and his breathing was deep and even. Silas was asleep in the chair by the hearth, his head slumped forward, his face etched with fatigue. On the floor beside Leo lay Silas's own heavy sheepskin coat, tucked carefully around the boy's small frame. He had given his own source of warmth to her child. In that quiet, gray dawn, with the world hushed and white outside, Alara looked at the sleeping man and the sleeping child, and the last of the ice around her heart began to melt. She had let him in. She had let him care for her son, and he had not failed them. The blizzard passed, leaving behind a world sculpted in silence and snow. The sun emerged, brilliant and cold, casting long blue shadows across the drifts. Inside the cabin, a fragile peace had settled. Leo was weak, but his fever was gone, and he was propped up by the fire, wrapped in Silas's coat, sipping a thin broth Alara had made. For 2 days, they spoke little, the shared ordeal having forged a new kind of understanding that didn't require words. The silence was no longer empty or tense. It was comfortable, companionable. On the 3rd day, as Silas mended a piece of tack by the fire and Alara stirred a pot of stew, the quiet was finally broken. It was Alara who spoke first, her voice soft in the warm air of the cabin. She did not look at him, but stared into the slow simmering pot as if the words were rising from the steam. "His name was Thorn," she said. It was not a confession, but a simple statement of fact, offered up into the quiet space between them. Jedediah Thorn. He owned the land we worked. He believed he owned us, too. She paused, her hand stilling its motion. He favored his fists, especially when he'd been drinking. She said nothing more. She didn't need to. The faded bruises on her arm, the haunted look in her eyes, the way she flinched at sudden movements, they all filled in the rest of the story. She had run, taking the only thing in the world that was truly hers, her son. Silas stopped his work. He looked at the rigid line of her back, at the slight tremble in the hand that held the spoon. He could feel the immense courage it took for her to offer up that small, painful piece of her past. It was a gift of trust, tentatively given. He knew he had to offer something in return. He set the leather strap aside and stared into the flames, the firelight catching the deep lines on his face. His own ghosts, usually kept so carefully locked away, rose to the surface. "I had a daughter," he said, his voice thick with a rust he couldn't clear. Her name was Lily. The name felt strange on his tongue, a relic from another life. She caught a fever, much like the boys. The doctor was a day's ride away, and a storm came in. He swallowed, the memory a physical lump in his throat. "My wife, Sarah." She never recovered. Not really. She faded. A year later, she was gone too. He fell silent. He had not spoken their names aloud in almost a decade. He had built this fortress of solitude on their graves, believing he deserved nothing more than to be haunted. Now, in the telling, he felt not just the familiar pain, but a small, clean lancing of the wound. Alara turned from the stove, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She saw him then, truly saw him for the first time. Not as a reclusive rancher or a reluctant savior, but as a man hollowed out by the same grief that had threatened to consume her. They were two solitary survivors, each marooned on their own island of pain. She walked to the table and poured 2 cups of coffee. She placed one on the small crate beside his chair. Their fingers brushed as he took it. This time, neither of them pulled away. They sat in the warm silence of the cabin. The unspoken tragedies of their lives finally laid bare, 2 flickering flames leaning toward each other in the dark. The house no longer felt like his. It was beginning to feel like theirs. The thaw came, slow and then all at once. The snow receded, leaving the earth damp and smelling of new life. The pantry was nearly bare, the blizzard having exhausted their supplies. A trip to the town of Redemption was unavoidable. The thought of it settled like a stone in Alara's stomach. Towns meant people. People meant stares, whispers, judgments. Silas seemed to sense her unease. "We'll go together," he said, the statement leaving no room for argument. "The boy can stay here. He's well enough to look after the chickens for a few hours." The journey in the buckboard was quiet. Silas handled the horses with a steady, capable hand, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Alara sat beside him, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her shawl pulled close around her shoulders as if it were armor. Redemption was little more than a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a church. As they pulled up in front of the store, Alara felt the familiar prickle of eyes on her. A woman in a worn dress, a child on her hip, stared. 2 old men sitting on a bench stopped their whittling to watch. She was a stranger, and she was with Silas Blackwood, the recluse who never came to town unless he had to, and never with a woman. Inside the store, the air was thick with the scent of coffee beans, cured leather, and gossip. The storekeeper, a portly man named Henderson, gave Silas a curt nod and let his eyes linger on Alara with undisguised curiosity. She kept her gaze lowered, focusing on the list of supplies she had memorized. Flour, salt, beans, coffee, a small bag of candy for Leo. As Silas was settling the bill, the bell above the door jangled violently. A man filled the doorway, blocking the afternoon light. He was large, dressed in clothes that were a little too fine for the dusty town, a silver-headed cane in his hand. He had a florid face and small, cruel eyes that scanned the room with an air of ownership. Alara's blood ran cold. It was him, Jedediah Thorne. His eyes landed on her, and a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "Well, well, look what the wind blew in. I thought I smelled something familiar." The store fell silent. Henderson froze, his hand hovering over the cash box. The few other customers stopped their browsing, turning to watch the unfolding drama. Thorne took a step toward her, his smile widening. "Running away won't do you any good, Alara. You know the terms of our agreement. You and the boy belong to me until your husband's debt is paid." He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into the flesh exactly where the old bruises lay hidden. Alara flinched, a small, involuntary gasp escaping her lips. She felt a wave of nausea and the old, familiar terror. She was trapped. But then, another hand closed over Thorne's wrist. A large, calloused hand that gripped with the unyielding strength of iron. Silas had moved so quietly, so quickly, she hadn't even seen him step forward. He did not look at Thorne. His dark eyes were fixed on Alara, his expression unreadable but for the granite set of his jaw. "Take your hand off her," Silas said. His voice was not loud. It was a low, chillingly calm rumble that cut through the silence of the store. Thorne sneered, his arrogance overriding his caution. "This is none of your concern, Blackwood. This is a private matter between me and my property." Silas's grip tightened. Thorne's face paled, and he winced in pain. Silas still did not look at him. He gently pulled Alara behind him, creating a human shield between her and her tormentor. He placed his other hand on her shoulder, a steady, grounding weight. It was a public declaration. Then he turned his head slowly, his eyes, cold as river stones, finally meeting Thorn's. "She's with me," he said, the words dropping into the thick silence. "She's chosen her place." The finality in his tone was absolute. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, as immovable as the mountains on the horizon. Thorn, for all his bluster, was a bully who preyed on the weak. Faced with Silas's quiet, unbreakable resolve, his bravado crumbled. He wrenched his hand free, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. "This isn't over, Blackwood," he spat, backing toward the door. Silas did not reply. He simply stood there, a silent guardian, until Thorn had disappeared into the dusty street. The spell in the store was broken. Henderson cleared his throat loudly and busied himself with stacking cans. The other customers suddenly found their own business intensely interesting. Silas turned to Alara. Her face was pale, but her eyes were wide with a look of stunned disbelief. He had not just defended her. He had claimed her. In front of the whole town, he had drawn a line in the sand and placed her safely on his side. He had stood up for her when no one else ever had. He had redeemed a promise he had made long ago to a ghost, by keeping it for a living, breathing woman. He picked up their sacks of supplies. "Let's go home," he said. The ride back was filled with a new kind of silence. It was not the silence of strangers, nor the companionable quiet of shared grief. It was a silence that hummed with unspoken significance, with the weight of the words spoken in the general store. "She's with me." The words echoed in the space between them, changing everything. When they arrived back at the cabin, the sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. Leo ran out to meet them, his face alight with joy. He threw his arms around his mother's legs, then looked up at Silas, a shy smile on his face. He held up a small, perfectly formed brown egg. "For you," he said, holding it out to Silas. Silas looked down at the small offering in the boy's hand. He knelt, his knees cracking so he was eye level with the child. He accepted the egg with a gravity befitting a great treasure. "Thank you, Leo," he said, his voice softer than Alara had ever heard it. "We'll have it for breakfast." The atmosphere in the cabin that night was transformed. The single room, which had once felt like a temporary shelter, a place of refuge, now felt like something more. Felt like a beginning. Felt like a home. Over the next few days, a subtle but profound shift occurred in their routines. Alara found herself humming as she worked, a forgotten tune from her own childhood. She took one of Silas's worn flannel shirts that was beyond mending and, with careful stitches, fashioned it into a new, warmer shirt for Leo. The act was intimate, proprietary. She was turning this man's past into her son's future. Silas, in turn, began to fill the empty spaces of the cabin with life. He spent an afternoon repairing the broken runner on an old wooden rocking chair that had sat, covered in a dusty sheet, in the darkest corner of the room. It had been Sarah's. For years, he couldn't bear to look at it, a monument to all he had lost. Now he sanded the wood, tightened the joints, his hands working with a craftsman's care. He was not erasing the past, but making room for a new present. One evening, after the work was done, he brought the finished rocker and placed it by the hearth. He didn't say anything, but the invitation was clear. Later, as the fire crackled, Alara sat in the chair, Leo curled in her lap, his head resting on her shoulder. She rocked slowly, the gentle creak of the wood a soothing rhythm in the quiet room. Silas sat at the table carving a piece of wood. He was making a small, detailed horse for Leo, a proper toy to replace the rough bird. He worked quietly, the shavings falling to the floor. Suddenly, a sound filled the cabin that had not been heard there in a decade. It was the sound of a child's laughter. Leo was giggling as his mother tickled him. A pure, unfettered sound of joy that echoed off the wooden walls, chasing the last of the shadows from the corners. Silas stopped his carving. He looked at the woman and child in the firelight, their faces glowing with warmth and affection. A smile, a real unforced smile, touched his own lips. The hollow space in his chest, the one that had ached for so long, felt full. Weeks bled into a month, and the season turned again. The harshness of winter gave way to the tentative green of spring. A new routine emerged, one woven not from necessity and silence, but from a gentle, unspoken companionship. From the hard soil of their shared solitude, something new and resilient had begun to grow. Silas found himself talking more, not in long speeches, but in small observations shared over the dinner table. He told Leo the names of the birds that returned to the plains, pointing out the meadowlark and the hawk. He showed Alara which wild herbs were good for seasoning and which were good for tea. He was sharing his world, opening the gates to the lonely kingdom he had guarded for so long. Alara, in turn, brought a softness to the rigid angles of his life. She planted a small garden just outside the cabin door, coaxing tender shoots of mint and thyme from the dark earth. The scent of them would drift in on the afternoon breeze, a fragrance of life and persistence. She mended his clothes with neat, almost invisible stitches, a quiet act of care that spoke volumes. The cabin no longer felt like a man's austere shelter. It bore the unmistakable touch of a woman's hand, the gentle imprint of a family. One afternoon, Silas was teaching Leo how to skip stones across the creek that ran through the property. He showed the boy how to hold the flat stone, how to flick his wrist just so. After several clumsy attempts, Leo managed to make one skip 3 times before sinking. He whooped with delight, his face beaming with pride. Silas felt a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the spring sun. He was not just providing shelter anymore, he was building a childhood. Alara watched them from the porch, a basket of laundry on her hip. She saw the patience in Silas's posture, the gentle way he corrected the boy's grip. She saw the open, trusting way Leo looked up at him. These two solitary souls, a man who had lost a child and a child who had never had a father, were finding what they needed in each other. The rocking chair by the fire became the center of their evenings. After Leo was asleep in the small cot Silas had built for him, Alara would sit and mend, the rhythmic creak of the rocker a comforting counterpoint to the crackling flames. Silas would sit at the table, oiling a piece of leather or reading from a worn book. They didn't always talk, but the silence was a shared blanket, warm and secure. One evening, Alara looked up from her sewing and found Silas watching her, his expression thoughtful. "You're a good mother, Alara," he said, the words simple and direct. Her hands stilled in her lap. No one had ever said that to her. In her old life, she had only ever been a possession, a worker, a vessel for a man's rage. To be seen, truly seen, for the one thing she took pride in was a gift beyond measure. "You are a good man, Silas," she replied, her voice steady. He simply nodded, accepting the words as she had accepted his. It was enough. The ghosts of Sarah and Lily were still there, he knew. They would always be a part of him. But they were no longer howling specters. They were quiet memories, and they had made room. The house was full again, not with echoes of the past, but with the quiet, steady pulse of a new life. From silence had come warmth. From sorrow, a fragile hope. The summer settled over the plains, a long, warm breath that turned the grasses gold. The days were long and filled with the comfortable rhythm of shared work. The nights were clear, the sky a vast sweep of stars that seemed close enough to touch. The cabin was no longer a refuge from the world, but the center of it. One evening, after a long day of haying, they sat on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky. Leo was asleep inside, tired out from his efforts to help by carrying single stalks of hay to the barn. A comfortable silence stretched between them, punctuated by the chirp of crickets. Silas's heavy sheepskin coat, the one he had wrapped Leo in during the fever, still hung on its peg just inside the door. It had remained there through the spring and now into the summer, a silent testament to the night their lives had irrevocably changed. It was no longer just his coat. It was a symbol of his protection, a part of their shared history. It belonged there as much as they did. Elara sat in the rocker. Silas had moved out to the porch, her mending basket resting in her lap, her hands still for once. Silas leaned against the porch rail, his gaze on the distant horizon, but his awareness was entirely focused on the woman beside him. He had grown so accustomed to her presence that he could no longer imagine the silence that had once filled this space. Her quiet strength had become the foundation of his world. He thought of the day he had first seen her, a desperate, defiant figure braced against the wind. He thought of the bruises on her arm, the fever in the night, the confrontation in the town. They had weathered so many storms together, both literal and figurative. He had offered her shelter, and she, in turn, had given him back his life. He set his empty coffee cup down on the railing and walked over to stand behind her rocker. He placed his hands on the smooth, worn wood of the chair's back, his fingers resting just above her shoulders. It was a gesture of quiet possession, of gentle claim. He did not need to say the words aloud anymore. His actions, day after day, said everything. You are home. You are safe. You are mine to protect. Elara stopped the gentle motion of the rocker. She leaned her head back slightly until it brushed against his shirt. She looked up at the first star appearing in the twilight sky. Then, she slowly raised her hand, covering his where it rested on the chair. Her touch was light, but it was an anchor. It was an answer, an acceptance, promise. The warmth of her hand seeped into his. In that simple, silent touch, a home was finally truly built. It was a place made not of wood and stone, but of trust earned and sorrows shared. The coat on the hook was no longer his alone.